We're joined today by John Horrigan, who runs the Pew Internet and American Life Project, or at least contributes significantly to that project. John studies the online behavior of broadband internet users, mobile internet users, and consumers of other leading-edge information technology. John, we appreciate you spending time with us today. You're in demand as you rolled out the latest sort of broadband usage statistics, internet usage statistics. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the 63% figure that, according to the data, 63% of Americans are now subscribing and utilizing broadband. That's an uptick, you said, relative to data in past years. Could you talk a bit about that?
That's right. We have 63% of Americans having broadband in our latest data, which is up from 55% a year ago. So that's about a 15% increase in that time frame. And it also represents a nice jump from our figures from the end of 2008 when we registered 57% of Americans with broadband. So the first quarter of 2009 saw, to us, a somewhat surprising uptick in broadband adoption to that 63% number.
Great. Another big figure was usage among rural Americans, and certainly here in Washington, when policymakers are talking about deploying broadband and increasing broadband adoption, oftentimes rural Americans are one of the larger segments of the population that are focused on. We did see an increase in that. Could you tell us a bit about why that's the case?
Yeah, well, we did see an increase in rural adoption up to 46% from 38% a year earlier. So there's still a gap in rural broadband adoption relative to the average. We still find that rural Americans are a lot more likely than other Americans to say they simply can't get broadband. But it is encouraging to see a steady growth among the rural population. I think some of the infrastructure issues may be being taken care of as rollout proceeds. Plus, you see in rural America generally an older population than in the rest of America, and they've been later to the broadband party than lots of other Americans, and that could be a reason for the increase in rural American broadband adoption.
Sure. You talked about in your presentation that usage among the elderly, older Americans, is also up, especially with 65 and above. I think the numbers were up maybe over 10% relative to the last study. Is there any segment of that is rural? Did any of those folks claim themselves as rural Americans, and was that significant?
Yes, I mean, we did see a jump in senior citizen broadband adoption from 19% to 30% of the 65 and older population in the past year, and some of that was clearly among rural Americans. So we see as time passes more and more people understanding that broadband is an important part of being connected in the modern world. So again, older Americans are a little bit later to the broadband party than some Americans, but slowly but surely many are starting to get the high-speed connection at home.
Sure. Well, certainly we don't want to paint an overly rosy picture and give viewers the impression that there's no work left to be done. Barriers, certainly, which is a big part of this study. Indifference or respondents citing the internet as not relevant to the way they live their life, that remains a challenge. Could you talk a bit about what some of the larger barriers are to folks that may have access to the internet or broadband but choose not to adopt?
Yeah, when we ask non-broadband users, and there are really two sets of non-broadband users, there are non-internet users, and that's 21% of the general population, and there are dial-up internet users, the remaining 7% of people who dial up to get online. And when we ask those groups why they don't have broadband, we find that most often people are citing issues pertaining to the relevance of the internet. So about half of non-adopters say, it's just not for me, or I'm never going to switch from dial-up to broadband. And those kinds of responses suggest that these people just aren't aware of what the broadband experience is about. They're not aware of the doors that broadband opens to information, which means that promoting digital literacy and computer training would be the way to address those kinds of barriers for that large swath of the non-adopting population who say it's just not relevant to them.
Well, John, it's interesting data, and we appreciate you taking the time to tell Next Gen Web about it today.
Happy to be with you.